My name is Aubrey, and despite years of pretending that the distance did not bother me, I still walked into this recent Christmas with a faint hope that perhaps things could unfold differently from every holiday before it. I kept telling myself that families sometimes surprise you, that people can change, and that maybe I would finally feel like more than an afterthought. That hope thinned almost immediately after I stepped into the old townhouse, because the familiar dynamic settled in. The moment conversations flowed around me rather than toward me, no one had to say anything unkind for me to feel it. The silence between interactions carried a weight I had known for far too long, the type that grows heavier when you try to ignore it. The gift exchange only sharpened what was already obvious. My brother received a full vacation package to Hawaii with printed itineraries and prepaid bookings tucked neatly inside the envelope, the kind of present chosen with intention and enthusiasm. My sister opened a velvet box holding a brand new Rolex, complete with the original price tag peeking from beneath the cushion, as if the value was part of the message they wanted her to hear. Their laughter filled the room with an energy that never seemed to reach me. When my turn arrived, all I was handed was a small paper bag containing a single $2 lottery ticket, accompanied by my father's casual remark, "Good luck." It landed with a finality that told me everything I needed to know. What none of us realized that night was that a week later, the meaning of that moment would shift beyond anything they could have predicted. If you want to hear the truth behind everything that followed, make sure you follow or subscribe so you never miss the rest of this story. The days leading up to Christmas always stirred a small hope in me, a hope that carried more weight than I ever dared to admit. I tried to convince myself that preparation might set a different tone this year. So, I spent the afternoon wrapping simple gifts with more care than the items inside probably deserved. Each ribbon, each folded corner, and each tag with a handwritten note felt like my attempt to create a sense of unity, even if I remained the only person trying. I arrived at my parents' old townhouse with those small packages in a reusable bag and a determination to keep the atmosphere light, because walking into that place had always required more emotional effort than I wished. Mom greeted me with a polite smile that faded almost as quickly as it appeared. She took the gifts from my hand and placed them on a far end of the table with a quiet efficiency that left no room for conversation. Dad nodded from across the living room without shifting his focus, and the distance between us felt unmistakably familiar. Their lack of warmth tightened something in my chest. Yet I tried to breathe through the discomfort and focus on the reason I had come. The hallways soon echoed with the sound of my brother's arrival. My brother Brandon walked in wearing an expression that suggested he carried the holiday rather than simply attending it, and his greeting to me held a measured politeness that bordered on superiority. I offered him a small wrapped book I had chosen after remembering a conversation we had months earlier, but he accepted it with a neutral murmur that made me wonder why I had ever tried to hold on to that memory. A few minutes later, another voice filled the kitchen doorway, belonging to my sister Lydia. Her first remark reached me before she fully stepped inside, a casually delivered observation about how she thought I might have arrived earlier to help, though her tone suggested she never expected me to be capable of offering meaningful assistance. I let the comment pass because responding would only create the tension she seemed to enjoy provoking. I handed her a small skincare set I had picked out with care, and she glanced at it long enough to say that she hoped I remembered to include a gift receipt. Her words carried an edge she did not bother to soften. Despite the coldness that followed their entrances, I continued arranging the table settings with the hope that the meal might soften the edges between us. I straightened utensils, adjusted napkins, and filled glasses with water because those tasks gave my hands something to do while my heart tried to keep steady. The townhouse carried memories of different years when these preparations had felt hopeful, but I avoided dwelling on that because nostalgia had a way of making present moments hurt more. As I worked, I overheard brief conversations between Mom and Dad about plans that did not include me. And though their voices were not hostile, they folded around each other in a way that emphasized the separation I had grown up feeling. I reminded myself not to take it personally, even though every instinct pushed me in the opposite direction. My goal was to create calm, not to disrupt it, and I focused on that intention with everything I had. Brandon walked by as I placed the last fork, and he commented on how I always seemed to choose the simplest gifts every year. His tone suggested amusement, though not the friendly kind. Lydia joined him a moment later, and she added that she hoped I had not overextended myself with whatever was inside the small boxes I had brought. Neither of them spoke loudly, yet the impact of their voices settled heavily on my shoulders. I reminded myself to stay composed because rising to their remarks would only give them more to critique. The hours moved slowly as I continued making small adjustments to the table, using the task as a shield. I tried to contribute ideas about the dinner plans, but they slid into the room without landing anywhere because no one seemed interested in picking them up. I listened while they discussed schedules, travel plans, and holiday traditions that excluded me without ever acknowledging the omission. At one point, I caught myself nodding along, even though I had nothing to add because participating seemed easier than confronting the reality that my presence felt optional. I held on to a faint belief that the evening might still take a positive turn. Hope had always been the part of me they never managed to extinguish. I kept imagining that one meaningful conversation or one unexpected expression of appreciation could shift everything, even though logic told me otherwise. I gathered myself, sat quietly at the edge of the living room, and waited for the moment when dinner would begin, believing that perhaps the holiday spirit might soften something in this family. On Christmas evening, everything unfolded in the exact way I had feared, even though I had tried to prepare myself for whatever might happen. I sat at the long dining table after helping Mom finish the last few dishes, and the faint tension in the room pressed against my chest in a way that felt familiar. Everyone settled into their seats with a sense of ceremony, as if the night had been rehearsed without including me. I tried to steady my breathing while reminding myself that I had come here hoping for more than a quiet place at the edge of the celebration. The meal began with the usual conversations that moved quickly around the table, skipping over anything I said. I kept my focus on the food rather than searching for a space to contribute because the silence that met my earlier comments had left me discouraged. Brandon complimented Mom on the ham, and she brightened in a way I had never been able to spark. Lydia added her opinions about travel plans for the spring, and Dad listened closely as if every detail she offered held real substance. I folded my hands in my lap beneath the table to steady my frustration because reacting would only deepen the divide I already felt. When dinner plates were cleared, Mom announced it was time for gifts. My pulse picked up because this part of the evening had always carried its own brand of discomfort. She handed Brandon a large envelope with a proud smile that seemed almost performative, and he opened it slowly to prolong the moment. Inside was a complete vacation package to Hawaii with confirmations for flights, accommodations, and activities printed neatly behind glossy pages. He looked pleased with himself as he held the papers up for everyone to see, and the admiration he received swept through the room without hesitation. I offered a polite smile, even though the gesture felt strained. Mom then passed Lydia a small velvet box, and the confidence in Lydia's expression grew even before she lifted the lid. A new Rolex rested inside with its original tag tucked discreetly beneath the cushion, and the air shifted with the kind of approval I had never experienced at this table. She leaned back with satisfaction as Dad told her the watch suited her, and their attention lingered on her delight long enough to create a pause before anyone acknowledged that one gift remained. Mom reached for a small bag with thin handles, and the way she placed it in front of me made it clear that no one expected much emotion for my reaction. I opened it without rushing, though part of me braced for the disappointment I knew might follow. At the bottom of the bag sat a single $2 lottery ticket with a small bend in the corner. There was no note, no thoughtful message, and no attempt to mask how little consideration had gone into choosing it. Before I could form a response, Dad looked at me with a neutral expression and said the words that confirmed everything I already felt. "Good luck." The sentence carried a finality that stung more than I wanted to admit, and the quiet after it sank into the room with an uncomfortable certainty. I nodded politely and forced a small smile to keep my expression steady because showing hurt would only make the moment more humiliating. Lydia glanced at me as if waiting for a reaction she could comment on, but I kept my posture still. Brandon returned to admiring his travel documents, and neither of them seemed interested in seeing how I felt. I folded the lottery ticket and slipped it into my coat pocket with a care that had more to do with maintaining my dignity than preserving the paper itself. The conversation resumed almost immediately without anyone acknowledging my gift or the lack of sentiment behind it. They laughed about trip itineraries, favorite restaurants, and future holidays that did not appear to include me. I listened for a moment with a tight chest before realizing that staying any longer would only worsen the feeling that had settled in my stomach. I pushed my chair back slowly to avoid drawing attention, although I knew they would not look up even if I made noise. Mom glanced briefly in my direction without asking where I was going, and Dad kept talking while gesturing at Brandon's envelope. I stood, gathered my coat, and offered a quiet farewell that blended into the noise of their conversation. No one paused to acknowledge my departure. The sound of their voices continued without interruption, carrying on as if my presence had never mattered at all. I stepped out of the townhouse with the cold air tightening around me. And for the first time that night, I let myself feel the weight of everything I had tried so hard to ignore. 1 week later, everything moved in a direction I had never imagined. And the shift began with a simple decision I made after a long day at work. I stopped by the small convenience store near my apartment, mostly because I needed a break from the thoughts that had followed me since Christmas night. I walked inside with the intention of buying something to drink, but my footsteps slowed when I passed the row of lottery tickets displayed near the counter. The memory of Dad handing me that $2 ticket flickered through my mind. And instead of letting the bitterness settle again, I reached for a new ticket that felt like a quiet reclaiming of my own choices. I purchased it without any expectation attached to the act because buying a lottery ticket had never been part of my routines. Still, there was something oddly comforting about holding a ticket I had chosen for myself rather than accepting one given without care. I slipped it into my purse and returned home without thinking about it again until the following morning. The ticket remained tucked beneath my planner, and I did not even remember it during breakfast because my thoughts had turned to work deadlines and a few errands I needed to complete. Later that evening, as I sorted through mail and small papers on my kitchen counter, the ticket was revealed again. I paused long enough to check the numbers with a half-hearted assumption that it would amount to nothing more than a few passing seconds of distraction. As I compared the sequence on my ticket to the winning numbers listed online, I felt a strange stillness enter my body. Every number aligned with perfect precision. I read the confirmation twice before fully processing that the grand prize was $15 million written out in full. The realization spread slowly like warmth, reaching places inside me that had been cold for years. I sat at my table for several minutes without moving because the shift in my circumstances felt almost unreal. My breath steadied only after I repeated the numbers aloud, each one refusing to change no matter how many times I confirmed them. I had won something far beyond anything I had ever imagined. Yet my first impulse was not to celebrate. Instead, I placed the ticket inside a folder and hid it in a locked drawer because safeguarding the truth felt more important than reacting to it. I needed time to understand what this meant for my life and what choices lay ahead. And I also needed silence while my thoughts settled into a clearer shape. The next day, I contacted the state lottery office, confirmed the win directly, and scheduled the steps required to claim the prize. The representative walked me through each instruction with a calm professionalism that helped me stay grounded while navigating something that could have easily overwhelmed me. I followed every direction, carefully securing documents and planning how to keep this part of my life protected until I decided who needed to know. The weight of the secrecy felt heavy, but it was also strangely empowering to hold something that belonged only to me. Meanwhile, my family had no idea what had happened. They had not reached out since the night I left the townhouse, and the silence between us confirmed how little they noticed my absence. I knew they believed their $2 ticket had gone home in my pocket, and part of me suspected that if any news broke about a winner in our state, they might assume they had played a part in it. I underestimated how quickly that assumption would take root. 3 days after I confirmed the prize, I received a message from Mom that carried an unusual level of enthusiasm. She asked if I had checked the ticket they gave me and followed the question with a long explanation about a rumor circulating online that someone in our region had won. Her sudden interest felt abrupt after the indifference she had shown during Christmas dinner, and I sensed the direction her thoughts were already moving. I replied briefly, saying I had been busy, and left it at that. The following morning, Lydia sent a message with a tone that bordered on eager anticipation. She asked whether I had looked at the numbers, followed by a comment suggesting that it would be amazing for the family if the winning ticket happened to be the one they gave me. Brandon followed shortly after with a message of his own, and his wording implied that he saw the potential prize as something that naturally belonged to all of them. Their sudden effort to contact me revealed how quickly their priorities shifted when they sensed an opportunity. By the end of the day, their messages changed from hopeful to insistent. Mom asked whether I had turned the ticket in. Dad wanted to know whether I planned to share the blessing. Lydia hinted that keeping the prize to myself would be selfish after everything they had supposedly done. Brandon sent a final message suggesting that the right thing to do would be to divide the money evenly among the family, and the pressure behind his words became sharper with every sentence. They all believed the winning ticket was the one they had handed me so casually. None of them considered that I might have bought my own ticket, or that the truth could be entirely different from the assumption that benefited them most. As their messages continued to arrive, I realized that the peace I felt when I left their house on Christmas had been replaced by a new kind of tension. However, this time I held something they could not control. The winning ticket was mine alone, and the decision about what came next belonged solely to me. The next morning arrived with a tension that settled over me before I even opened my eyes, as if the entire world had quietly shifted while I slept. I had expected some confusion from my family once they learned that the winning ticket belonged to me, but I had not imagined how quickly the tone of everything would change. My phone vibrated several times before I even reached for it, and the first message that caught my attention was an email from Lydia, whose name appeared on the screen with a subject line written entirely in capital letters. I knew she was preparing to confront me long before I opened it, yet the length of the message still surprised me. She questioned everything from my honesty to my sense of responsibility, insisting that the money was meant to uplift the entire family. She wrote that I should feel grateful for the opportunity to finally contribute something meaningful, which revealed more about her view of me than she may have intended. Although her tone was coded in politeness, the underlying accusation felt unmistakable, and it took effort to read every line without reacting. Before I could respond, a notification from a social platform appeared. Brandon had posted a vague but pointed message about loyalty within families, and several of his friends commented on it with sympathetic replies. He had not mentioned my name, yet anyone who knew us would recognize the implication. It struck me as deeply unfair because he had never shown an ounce of interest in my life until there was something to demand from it. The choice to involve the public instead of speaking to me directly felt calculated, almost as if he wanted to shape the narrative before I even had a chance to speak for myself. My phone rang while I was still reading comments under his post. It was Mom calling, and I could hear the tremble in her voice the moment I answered. She told me she had barely slept because she had convinced herself the situation could still be salvaged if I agreed to be reasonable. She repeated that the family deserved to experience relief after years of stress, as though my personal journey had not involved struggles of its own. Her tone wavered between pleading and subtle guilt, and when she asked me to think about how much they had done for me, I felt a familiar ache. I loved her, yet it was clear that she viewed the prize as a collective asset rather than something I had earned privately through my own purchase. When the call ended, another message appeared from Dad. His text did not contain softness or hesitation. He wrote that handling a large sum improperly could create problems for everyone, and he emphasized that sharing would prevent unnecessary tension. Though he did not mention consequences directly, the implication lingered beneath every word. The shift in his attitude felt abrupt, almost transactional, and I realized he expected me to yield simply because he had spoken first. As the pressure built, I heard a knock on my front door. I half expected one of my family members to arrive unannounced, but when I opened it, Julia stood there with a warm bag of pastries and a steady expression. She had been my best friend for years and had learned to sense when something weighed heavily on me. I let her inside, and she listened while I explained every message, every accusation, and every assumption that had fallen on me since morning. Her presence grounded me in a way nothing else could have because she treated the situation with sincerity instead of entitlement. She reminded me that the ticket I purchased belonged fully to me and that the reaction of my family reflected their expectations, not any failure on my part. Hearing her say it aloud eased the tightness in my chest because for the first time that morning, someone acknowledged my feelings instead of my winnings. After she left, I sat alone for a long moment to gather myself, and then I typed a single message into the family group thread. I explained that the winning ticket was not the one they had placed in my gift bag on Christmas night. I clarified that the prize came from the ticket I had purchased independently at a convenience store near my home. I did not attack anyone or defend myself with insults. I stated facts cleanly because I understood the truth needed no embellishment. When I pressed send, I knew the reaction would be swift. Yet, I also knew that my decision had to be made with clarity. I placed my phone aside afterward and allowed the silence of the room to settle around me. For the first time since the drawing, I felt a sense of ownership, not just over the prize, but over the direction of my life. I understood that the storm brewing around me was not about fairness, but about expectations placed on me long before I ever held a winning ticket. 3 weeks later, the court date arrived with a weight that settled on me the moment I stepped inside the building. The reality of the lawsuit finally felt tangible because my family had decided to push this conflict as far as they possibly could. They had hired a private attorney whose reputation centered on aggressive litigation, which showed me how determined they were to claim ownership of something that had never belonged to them. Their willingness to invest in a legal fight made it clear that they viewed me not as a daughter, but as a resource. They believed they were entitled to control. And that thought settled over me like a cold realization I could no longer avoid. I met my attorney, Marcus Hale, near the entrance to the courtroom. It was the first time he formally introduced himself outside our earlier phone consultations, and he carried a calm confidence that steadied me before we walked in. Marcus reviewed the outline of our evidence in a low voice, emphasizing that the facts were on my side because the winning ticket had been purchased by me without any involvement from my family. He assured me that the clarity of the timeline and the recorded proof from the convenience store would dismantle any claims made against me. His tone stayed measured as he explained that the hearing would likely move quickly once the judge saw the documentation. The clerk called the case, and we stepped forward while my parents avoided eye contact. Brandon sat with crossed arms and Lydia whispered something to him without acknowledging my presence. Their attorney opened by stating that the winning ticket had been gifted to me during Christmas Eve and that the prize money therefore belonged to the entire family. He presented the narrative with a rehearsed confidence, describing the ticket as a symbol of collective generosity rather than an individual possession. The claim rested entirely on the idea that I was obligated to share because the gift came from them, and the attorney attempted to frame me as ungrateful for refusing to do so. Marcus stood to respond with a calm that contrasted sharply with the emotional tone used by their side. He began by stating clearly that the winning ticket was not the one given to me by my family and that I had purchased my own ticket separately at a convenience store near my home. He submitted the time-stamped receipt, the corresponding payment record, and a request to allow the court to view footage from the store's security camera. The judge approved the request without hesitation because the documentation aligned with established procedures for confirming ownership of lottery claims. The video played on a monitor near the front, showing me entering the store, selecting a ticket, and paying for it. The clarity of the footage left no room for speculation because the sequence matched the receipt exactly. The store clerk, who had agreed to serve as a witness, stepped forward when called and confirmed that I was the person who bought the ticket. He recalled the purchase clearly since I had used a card rather than cash, a detail that matched the records. His straightforward testimony reinforced the chain of evidence and left the opposing attorney visibly unsettled. The attorney representing my family attempted to challenge the timeline by suggesting that the footage might have been recorded on a different date. Yet Marcus countered by presenting a verification form signed by the store manager. The form authenticated the time, the date, and the file export process, which eliminated any possibility of tampering. Each attempt to undermine the documentation failed because the paper trail had been preserved with strict accuracy. The judge asked a series of questions that highlighted the inconsistencies in my family's statements, and each answer they provided only deepened the contrast between their assumptions and the verifiable facts. My mother eventually spoke, insisting that the ticket must have been the one they gifted because she remembered handing me the small holiday bag. The judge listened without interruption before asking whether she had any proof that the gifted ticket matched the winning numbers. She had none because the ticket they gave me had never been recorded or photographed. Brandon tried to add that family gifts should be considered shared assets. Yet the judge reminded him that personal lottery winnings belong to the individual who purchased the ticket unless a written agreement states otherwise. His expression shifted immediately because he realized that nothing in their argument held legal weight. Marcus delivered the final statement by reiterating that the winning ticket had been purchased solely by me and that every piece of evidence supported that conclusion. The judge ruled in my favor with a clarity that left no doubt, stating that the claim presented by my family lacked proof, consistency, and legal foundation. The decision ended the dispute entirely, and the judge dismissed the case without granting any room for further argument. My family remained seated in silence, unable to respond. While the courtroom emptied around us, I stepped outside with Marcus, who simply nodded and said, "You handled this with more strength than most people would." His calm acknowledgement settled something inside me because it marked the first moment in weeks that I felt ownership of my life again. The truth finally stood firm in a place where facts mattered more than manipulation. And for the first time, I knew I had chosen the right fight. A few months after the trial ended, I began to understand how consequences settle into people's lives with a patience that feels almost deliberate. I kept my focus on rebuilding my routines. Yet the ripple effects of everything that happened reached every corner of my family. I did not seek updates. Although stories still found their way to me through neighbors, coworkers, and the occasional social media post, each detail revealed how the truth has a way of resurfacing, even when people try to outrun it. Mom had always taken pride in being the one others consulted for advice about etiquette, community events, or family conflicts. Her reputation was a small kingdom she guarded carefully. But the fallout from the lawsuit reshaped the image she projected for years. People who once smiled at her with admiration began stepping away with cold politeness. The community she thought she controlled no longer viewed her as a victim of an ungrateful daughter. They saw a woman who tried to take what was not hers and who faced the consequences of being exposed. She attempted to gather sympathy by telling partial versions of the story. Yet every attempt seemed to push more people away because no one could understand why she escalated things to that degree. Dad faced an outcome that felt equally heavy. He used to enjoy speaking with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, especially when discussing money or responsibility. The moment the truth came out in court, the authority he believed he had built crumbled faster than he expected. People stopped seeking his opinion on financial decisions or neighborhood issues. Even colleagues who once admired his assertive personality began questioning the values he held. I heard from a former neighbor that he avoided public gatherings because the whispers made staying feel unbearable. I did not celebrate his discomfort, although I recognized that this was a consequence of choices he made with full awareness. Brandon had been pursuing a promotion at work, and the timing of the lawsuit intersected with his evaluation period. When his manager discovered the details of the case, the perception of Brandon's judgment shifted. His attempt to demand a share of money that was never his did not reflect responsibility or leadership. From what I learned, his supervisor considered him unreliable during moments that called for mature decisions. The promotion went to someone else, and Brandon took a temporary leave soon after. I do not know if he understood how closely the repercussions were tied to his actions, but his frustration was noticeable, even through social media posts filled with vague complaints. Lydia experienced a reckoning that cut deep into her social circle. Her friends valued generosity, integrity, and loyalty, qualities she once pretended to champion. When they learned she participated in a lawsuit against her own sister for a ticket she never bought, their trust dissolved. Invitations stopped arriving, and her closest friend unfollowed her publicly. I heard she attempted to justify her behavior by insisting she only wanted fairness, although no one accepted the explanation. She had spent years crafting an image of sophistication and empathy. Yet one court case stripped that image away faster than she expected. Meanwhile, I chose a different path. I rented a small apartment on the other side of town, not because I wanted distance from them, but because I wanted closeness with myself. The quiet mornings helped me think clearly, and the absence of constant tension allowed my breathing to feel natural again. I filled my time with work, cooking, and small routines that gave me a sense of ownership over my life. Marcus occasionally checked on me to make sure everything related to the settlement remained stable, while Julia continued being the steady friend she had always been. The simplicity of that support grounded me more than any apology my family could have offered. I no longer maintained contact with them. The silence was not an act of revenge, but an acceptance that connection cannot survive without respect. I stopped waiting for remorse or explanations. Instead, I let the distance become a boundary that protected both my peace and my future. Letting go did not come from anger. It grew from a quiet recognition that I had been trying to hold together a family that valued ownership more than love. The freedom I felt afterward became a reminder that healing sometimes begins the moment we stop forcing ourselves to stay where we are not valued. As time passed, I learned that grief does not only come from losing people. Sometimes it comes from losing the version of family you wished existed. I allowed myself to acknowledge that longing without letting it define me. I realized that choosing myself was not an act of betrayal, but an act of survival. I embraced the clarity that arrived with independence and leaned into the peace that formed when I no longer apologized for guarding my well-being. I began trusting my own decisions again. And slowly, I built a life defined by choice rather than obligation. Looking back now, I understand the lesson I needed most. You cannot force people to treat you with care, and you cannot heal in an environment that thrives on control. True safety grows when you honor your limits and refuse to shrink so others feel comfortable. I learned that love without respect is not love, and loyalty without reciprocity becomes a quiet form of self-abandonment. Walking away became my first real act of strength, and the relief that followed confirmed I had waited too long to choose myself. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Your presence means more than you know, especially because these moments are easier to face when someone listens without judgment. I hope my experience encourages anyone who feels unseen to trust their worth and their boundaries. If this story resonates with you, I would be grateful if you shared your thoughts. Your reflections help others feel less alone, and I will read them with sincerity.